Greetings to everyone from unceded Coast Salish territory in Vancouver, Canada. If you're watching this at IAMCR in Eugene, it probably means that it's due to my involvement in peaceful protest against a pipeline from Alberta to Vancouver, one associated with the full expansion of the Alberta tar sands, which would unleash 1/3 of the entire carbon budget humanity has left to keep global warming under 1.5 degrees Celsius. It entails a huge increase in tanker traffic in the Salish Sea north of Seattle, global as well as local and regional environmental risks, including to my own campus, which is atop a mountain next to a tank farm about to double in size. This struggle has so many dimensions that I can just offer a few bullet points. Economic investment in the billions, the promise of jobs that appeals obviously to sections of the working class, Canada's possible drift towards status as a petro-state in which the interests of fossil fuels corporations override other sectors of the economy and society, intensified contradictions between Canadian regions with different political economies, ruptured relations between Ottawa, the federal government, and Indigenous people, the blatant contradiction between Canada's stated climate commitments and the expansion of its fossil fuel energy export policies, the complicity of corporate news media in extractivism versus a vibrant alternative media scene that we have here in British Columbia, but also the fertility of resistance, a determined alliance of many First Nations, coastal communities, and environmentally concerned citizens, parallel with a new center-left government in office in British Columbia, with support from the Green Party, has led to a partial victory of sorts. The company running the pipeline, Kinder Morgan, is going home to Texas, although with $4.5 billion of Canadian taxpayer money, and the federal government is taking over the pipeline directly, at least in the meantime. So the struggle continues. There's been a lot of confrontations. I hope it doesn't get to the point of Standing Rock kind of confrontations, but we could use international support. And my co-researcher, Derek O'Keefe, is presenting some aspects of this conflict in the political economy section at IAMCR on Saturday at 10:30. But meanwhile, if you have a poster of wavy-haired Justin Trudeau or still have a crush on him, please get over it. And if we cannot count on boy band politicians like him to develop a sustainable society, we can at least ask what we ourselves as communication scholars can do. And so what I want to do in this brief talk is offer a kind of top 10 list of ways that we could reorient our research and our practices in light of sustainability. The first point, I think, is to interrogate what we mean by sustainability, and I take that to be the point of this conference, Reimagining Sustainability. And the very title, I think, implies a resistance to reductionism. We often focus on climate crisis, but that broadens, I think, to other environmental problems and to questions of social structure, social justice, and governing logics, and to other existential threats from artificial intelligence and nuclear war to a long overdue pandemic. Yet I think climate crisis is a good focal point. Policy analysts describe it as a wicked problem, one that needs unprecedented cooperation, that demands short-term sacrifice for long-term and indeterminate benefits, in which those with the most power and wealth to fix the problem, or at least address it, are those most responsible for creating it in the first place. I think the entanglements and existential dangers of climate crisis call for rethinking established models. And we could start by asking, what do we want to sustain? A particular social order? Is it just a slogan for greenwashing? There may be many aspects of our culture, political and economic systems that need to be replaced, not sustained. Presumably what we want to sustain above all are the conditions and the well-being of the conditions of human life on Earth and a decent quality of life for all people and for future generations. And here models of democracy and justice are very relevant. Secondly, I think we could model a sustainable future in our own practices. I think it's important ethically and politically to demonstrate some connection between political commitments and our actual practices. So without falling into the trap of carbon shaming each other or validating a market-based consumer choice model of ecological rescue, we should reduce the carbon footprint of academic work while still working collaboratively. And I think we should focus on institutional accountability here. We could advocate for institutional policies like universities paying carbon offsets for work-related flights, disinvesting from fossil fuels, or providing more technical support for virtual meetings and conferences. Thirdly, I think we could adopt a crisis orientation for our communications as a discipline, and that is appropriate given a state of planetary emergency. We could adapt and expand Robert Cox's 4 ethical principles for environmental communication as a crisis discipline. First, enhance the ability of society to respond appropriately to environmental signals and to threats and opportunities vis-a-vis the sustainability of ecosystems, human rights, responsive government, and human communities. Secondly, make relevant information and decision-making processes transparent and accessible to members of the public, while those affected by environmental or other threats should also have the resources and ability to participate in decisions affecting their individual or community's health. I think that resonates with climate justice as a normative benchmark, as well as equality as a cornerstone of democratic communication. Our scholarship could take a lead from McChesney's quotation from one of his early books. Bob McChesney said that unless communication and information are biased towards equality, they tend to enhance social inequality. Thirdly, I think we could engage various groups to study, interact with, and share experiences of the natural world, but also the life worlds and perspectives of subaltern groups and communities. And fourthly, critically evaluate and expose communication practices that are constrained or suborned for harmful or unsustainable policies towards human communities and the natural world. So all taken together, that implies an explicitly political and normative grounding for communication research. A fourth on my top 10 list, is to rethink democracy in light of ecological crisis. This means foregrounding elements of power in our analysis in light of climate crisis as a wicked problem. We might use the notion of sustainable democracy, which refers both to the capacity of democracy to reproduce their institutions over time, but also maintaining compatibility with ecological reproduction. We need governance that ensures that economic and social life stays within ecological limits. That implies curtailing the voracious appetite of capital and placing limits on what majorities can decide. For example, we could follow the lead of countries like Bolivia or Ecuador that have institutionalized the rights of nature in their constitutions. We could evaluate public communication in light of not only new models of democracy, but also theories of social change. And I wonder whether the emphasis on the Habermasian public sphere and deliberative democracy has sometimes led us to pay insufficient attention to how power and ideology intrude in public discussion and policy making. I've used the public sphere concept myself as a benchmark in research and teaching, but I wonder if it's time to shelve it, especially liberal versions that emphasize individual rationality and the possibility of consensus, and to pay more attention to neo-Marxist analyses, such as the kind that you get in Monthly Review under the editorship of John Bellamy Foster, which foreground questions of power, structure, conflicting interests, and the logic of capitalism. Fifth, Indigenous knowledge. There's a movement in Canadian universities to indigenize the curricula and faculty and to validate traditional Indigenous knowledge. I sometimes worry that this is part of a strategy under the banner of reconciliation to incorporate the First Nations into an extractivist state, but it could be taken in a more radical direction if indeed Naomi Klein is right that Indigenous rights may be the best line of defense to defend our land and water against a rapacious economic system that is devouring its own material base. It could also mean rethinking the nation itself. Here in Canada, I think the progressive left has moved in the past generation from a view of Canada as kind of an economic satellite of the United States to viewing Canada itself as having a history of internal colonialism and redefining Canada as a settler colony. 6, connect environmental communication and studies of media and environment with analysis of structural logics and systemic social change. We need to avoid mediacentrism. It's not just about the media, and to consider that environmental collapse is embedded in extractivist capitalism or neoliberalism or capitalism more broadly, so that the possibility of sustainable human civilization depends on radical system change. Analyze the governing logics of the economic and political systems. How much change is possible within the system? What are the strategic points of leverage? I think that communication scholarship could also benefit from greater use of social movement theory, if indeed social movements, rather than great leaders or technological innovation on its own, or the supposedly self-correcting logic of markets are the best hopes for system change. And I would like to see more in the literature on green politics that connects critical analysis with strategy and vision for change. Speaking of which, the 7th point is alternative media. Planetary emergency provides another compelling reason to those that John Downing has already suggested in his radical media book, A Landmark in the Field. An additional reason for studying alternative media is that they are well positioned to generate the kind of communication we need to address planetary emergency. They have, broadly speaking, characteristics of oppositional content, horizontal communication, openness to social movements and social change, participatory production processes, an ability to stimulate productive popular engagement in political life as active citizens, and to help overcome the hope gap between our perception of the problem of climate change and our perceived ability to do anything about it. We need to recognize contradictions and hybridity and even convergence between so-called mainstream and alternative media. But there's a good deal of research, some of it done by my colleague Shane Gunster here at Simon Fraser University or by Newswatch Canada, indicating that there are indeed significant and persistent differences in how extractivism and energy politics are represented between corporate and alternative media. 8th, then, in light of what I've just said about effective environmental communication and the alternative media, we should be rethinking and perhaps restructuring journalism more broadly in the context of planetary emergency. At the moment, we seem to face a strange kind of dichotomy between traditional, objective, once dominant journalism of the kind you get in the New York Times or Washington Post versus the ideologically driven agitprop for the far right. If you think of Fox News, Breitbart, and so on. So the Washington Post and the New York Times, for example, bastions of the U.S. establishment, apologists for global neoliberalism, are now positioned as defenders of democracy, almost as alternative media. These media, to be sure, are raising, from a conventional liberal democratic standpoint, critical questions about the Trump presidency, but they are not focusing on Trump's assault on the environment, which maybe perhaps his worst sin or crime of all. So I think we need to think outside the box of establishment versus far right-wing media and search for other journalism paradigms in relation to system-wide ecological crisis. And I know that's been a popular pastime in the last 30 years or so for those of us in journalism studies, is thinking of new paradigms, going back to the days of civic and public journalism and so on. But I think we still need to be doing that, to ask ourselves, what is it that engages and empowers media audiences vis-a-vis environmental and societal sustainability? Again, to paraphrase my colleague Shane Gunster, some of the answers include solutions journalism, solutions-oriented journalism, more hopeful and engaged visions of climate politics, normalizing political engagement by ordinary people, telling stories of political success, and avoiding the sort of stultifying conflict narratives of conventional journalism of Party A versus Party B, which reduces politics to a game between insiders in which we're positioned as just sort of cynical spectators, and instead find the points of common ground for forward-looking action or find accessible conflicts that rouse people's anger and sense of empowerment to challenge business as usual. But there's little point discussing reinventing journalism without practical models of sustaining it, and that's the terrain of political economy and media reform. So environmental crisis gives us another reason for engaging in media reform, to remove an important blockage to climate action, namely a corporate-owned, commercially oriented so-called legacy news media system that, however, still influences public and policy agendas, has a significant online presence, and inhibits collective engagement with climate environmental action. If you read the conventional corporate dailies up here in Vancouver, you'd soon know what I mean. For my own engagement in environmental politics, most activists recognize those corporate media as hostile, but neither their importance nor the possibility of changing them registers on their radar screens. So that's the importance of popularizing critiques of corporate media and connecting environmental and media democracy struggles, the kind of work that Professors Pravini and Murdoch and many others are doing. But revitalizing journalism as the timely reporting of truths on matters of public concern now requires recuperating the very possibility of truth. And that's my 9th theme. that contemporary society, especially in the United States, is facing what some call a truth emergency with two dimensions. One is a disconnection between reality and beliefs, a decline of respect for evidence-based knowledge. And the second dimension is the development of different cognitive universes, the decline of publicly shared knowledge. With respect to the first point, the decline of reality-based knowledge, I sometimes wonder whether communication studies has been complicit in the cynical dismissal of science by climate change deniers, and indeed the irrelevance of facts in politics more broadly in the past few years. To quote Kurt Anderson, who's written a book, sometimes a bit over the top I should say, but nevertheless it's worth having a look at. Many of you are probably familiar with his book, Fantasyland, How America Went Haywire. He says, quote, "Postmodern intellectuals turned out to be useful idiots for the American right." He's not afraid of being provocative. So looking back on my own work, I sometimes wonder whether in my writing with Yutzi Zhao on the politics of objectivity, whether we had overdone the exposés of hidden ideologies and power legitimations underlying journalistic claims to objectivity. So I went back to check a chapter on epistemology, which we co-authored with Nick Dyer-Witherford, and was relieved to see that we argued for critical realism against both positivism, a faith in the undistorted representation of an objectively existing world through the careful observation of facts, on the one hand, and conventionalism on the other, a position expressed cheekily by John Hartley as a view of reality as the sense or product of discourse, which in my view leads to a kind of self-negating epistemological relativism. So what we argued for instead was critical realism, which means establishing causal links between deep structures and surface appearances, so that we can produce knowledge of the real, which makes its transformation possible. I think we should also worry about the decline of a shared reality, the rise of alternative cognitive universes, which technology actually probably makes worse through Facebook algorithms that just deliver the kind of news or information that you personally are interested and find acceptable and believe in the first place. Social media that enable individuated encounters with the news that confirm biases and filter out contravening facts, to paraphrase writer Franklin Foer in The Atlantic Monthly. And more recently, we have the possibility of manipulating video clips through software that deceives our senses into hearing people say what they never said, and virtual reality, which by definition confuses us about what is real. Those technologies could be used productively to convey experiences, for example, of the victims of climate change in distant locations and who are culturally dissimilar from us. But that's not obviously how the technology will be used, primarily under current institutional circumstances. So, as Franklin Foer has put it, few individuals will have the time or perhaps capacity to sort elaborate fabulation from truth. Our best hope may be outsourcing the problem, restoring cultural authority to trusted validators with training and knowledge, newspapers and universities. I don't know about newspapers, but it does imply a cultural rescue mission for universities, the production of public knowledge, and indeed of reality-oriented publics, which is my 10th theme, the role of the university as a sort of collective public intellectual. I think that creating a public world that is both evidence-based and pluralistic is an essential task of democratic journalism, and that's one reason that the crisis of journalism is so consequential. But it also opens a door for a very important public role for universities. I think that the right has campaigned for years to persuade us that academia is threatened by political correctness. It's a useful trope for those who want to maintain existing patterns of privilege. But a bigger threat is from the corporatization of universities, evident both in funding and management techniques, and commercialism, treating students as consumers rather than learners. I think if we take sustainability seriously, it's inherently political and threatening to powerful interests. I think in the context of planetary emergency, it's all the more important to defend universities as reasonably independent validators of knowledge. And internally, within our institutions, that requires, I think, changing incentives in order to revitalize the role of the public intellectual, reducing the pressure to confine research to narrowly measurable topics presented in arcane language for limited audiences. Conversely, reinforcing stable public funding and reducing the precarity of academic labor for so many of its employees, and reinforcing the interconnected institutions of tenure and academic freedom, which means not just the institutional autonomy of the university from corporations and state, which is very important, but also freedom for individual professors within their institutions to conduct and publish research, to engage in service to the community and public debate without institutional censorship. I think in fighting for those ideals in the academic workplace, through faculty unions, for example, we're helping to reinforce the institutional prerequisites for positive contributions from the university to a sustainable civilization. So basically, I think on many fronts, as the Tsleil-Waututh Nation has said up here in Coast Salish territory, the time is now to warrior up. So thanks very much.